Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions. And today's opinions will be about The Ballad of Perilous Graves by Jennings. Okay, so I finished reading this very New Orleans book last night, then I went to a Mardi Gras parade tonight, at which, when I was waiting for it to get started, I started reading another book that it turns out is set in New Orleans. So this is just going to be a slightly more New Orleans than usual kind of book review. So laissez le bon temps rouler. The Ballad of Perilous Graves starts by introducing us to Perry and his younger sister Brindy. They are true NOLA kids, learning music and magic in school, eating snowballs in the summer, running the streets with their friend Peaches, and dancing to the irresistible music of the city itself. When their grandfather goes missing and the powerful Haint Dr. Professor shows up to ask them to find his stolen songs, they know they are just sidekicks to Peaches, who is inhumanly strong, fearless, and before whom the laws of physics cower. Together, they set out on a quest to find the songs and Daddy Deke, with the help of a wild collection of family and strangers, and along the way, they may learn that they were wrong about who is the hero in their friend group. Meanwhile, a man named Casey is readjusting to life in New Orleans. He's just moved back for the first time since Hurricane Katrina, and now he's back to face the secrets about himself that he thought he left behind. And when his cousin goes missing, he might end up going further than he expected, while still never leaving the city limits. Okay, so yeah, this is a very New Orleans book. I have read books about New Orleans, I've read books set in New Orleans, and all of them capture a bit of the city's flavor, but this one might as well be steeped in a crawfish broil, seasoned with Tony's, and then coated in king cake sugar. And I will say, yeah, a lot of it felt really real, really alive, and so very true to this city. It's the kind of deep cultural stuff that you will not get from coming on vacation, and that I feel like I only have begun to see out of the corner of my eye after having lived here for more than a decade. And one of the things I love about it is that it really captures that feeling of layered reality that exists in New Orleans. Like, there's this shiny tourist facade over the crumbling history, over the living culture, over the flavors that are seeping into the air. There is so much going on in this city, and I feel like this book manages to capture that feeling. And I absolutely love the slow buildup of the world in this book. When you first start, you might as well be in the New Orleans I live in now. But slowly we are introduced to metaphors made reality, folklore turned into magic, and the deep weird that changes this from one of those books that is our world but with magic into something just very different. Is this our world? By the end, I'd say hell no. This is a second world fantasy. It is just built on our world-ish. This is a dream of our world that runs parallel, and I don't want to spoil anything, but that's also part of what's going on in the literal world building within the book, and it's all really cool and fun to dig into, and even more fun when they are literally visiting places I go to on a daily basis. I've had my own weird experiences in these places. Like, I know the world that it's walking on, and at the same time, everything is just ever so slightly weirder than the weird I experience, and some of it is a hell of a lot weirder than the weird I experience, which is cool. I think a good example of that is the storm. So the storm is a major part of this book, and it's not one particular storm. It's all the storms. And there's something very real about the way it's presented here. Like, yeah, that's sort of magic and metaphor, but it's also, the longer you live here, the more you realize that the different hurricanes sort of end up layered on top of each other. So you may be thinking about Francine, but you're feeling Ida behind it or hiding within it. And some of that in the real world is just the layers of trauma and damage caused by the storms. But there's something almost metaphorical about storms in New Orleans that this book really does capture. And all of the storms sort of come together to represent all the damage, all the passage of time, the systems that fail the city, and the outside world that seems to be trying to wash this illogical place off the map. And that, to me, was one of the strongest elements of this book. That really does capture something very real about living in New Orleans. And there's also the language. This book is written in varying levels of New Orleans dialects. Some of the POVs and some of the characters speak something a lot closer to standard American English. Some speak something a bit further away. Some have older versions of the dialect, some have newer. And I think overall it's very successfully done. It makes the language an intrinsic part of the world building and gives us so much character. I think, at least to me, it very much walked the line of readable but still very evocative. But at least to me, the dialect is something that desperately needs to be read aloud to make sense. It made for a longer getting to know you period in the book. Like, it just took me longer to find the rhythm and familiarity with the language of what I'm reading. And sometimes it does make for slower reading. And that's from someone who does have a lot of familiarity with New Orleans dialects, and specifically the New Orleans dialects that this is entrenched in. And I'm 100% sure that people who aren't used to Yat language and aren't used to Southern AAE are going to be, they're going to struggle a bit with this the same way my Northern friends literally cannot understand what people are saying to them when they come to visit New Orleans. But also, if you're one of those people that just hates books where the dialect is written out, you're not going to have a fun time with this book. That is an intrinsic part of it. And it's not every line, it's not every word, and like Perry is our most common POV character, and his syntax and grammar is just a lot closer to standard American English than some of the other characters. But it's a major part of the book. On the other side of that, I think it is something that is absolutely necessary for this book. It would have just sounded weird as hell to have, for example, Stagger Lee speaking as if he's writing up his SATs. And one more note on the language here. Because I know it's going to be jarring to a lot of people, the N-word does appear in this book in various forms. I am 90% sure it's only in a reclaimed way, as in black people using it companionably amongst themselves, but it's there. There are also some really immensely strong characters here, and I mean that both literally and figuratively. Peaches is a great example. She is fascinating, incredibly powerful character. She is pretty obviously, at least to me, a retelling of Pippi Longstocking, reimagined, steeped in the culture of New Orleans, and specifically the black culture of New Orleans. And I think in many ways, this really works. There's a running theme throughout the book of living stories, which adds a layer to the fact that Pippi is an existing story. There is solid folklore feeling to her stories, and the character herself of Pippi Longstockings was always based in the idea of believing yourself capable of anything makes you capable of anything, which is a form of living a story. And so it all creates this interesting layered effect of this idea of living stories. But I'm still trying to decide if I think the Pippi connection ever really went anywhere. Like, it's there, it's strong, there's a very serious theme built around it, but the theme doesn't feel resolved. And considering Pippi Longstocking is not a story that is inherent to New Orleans, like, as far as I know, there is no New Orleans connection to Pippi Longstocking, I was expecting it to actively go somewhere with this. And I just don't think it quite did. But there's also Perry and Brindy. I love them both. I think they are really interesting characters, and I think that they are well-written children characters, especially well-written in a book for adults about kids. Because yes, a lot of the main characters here are kids, but I do also think that they are aged incorrectly. For a good portion of the book, they feel like they are older than they should be. Like, we're told that Brindy is like 6 to 8 and Perry is 10, and they don't feel that young. And I think some of the feeling older than they are effect works as, like, part of the world as it's built. And it works with the general feeling of being forced to take on more responsibility than kids their age probably should have to by the quest that they're forced on. But sometimes I was just wondering why on earth they weren't written as Perry being 12 to 14 and Brindy being 10 or 11. First of all, they just objectively feel older than 10 and 8 years old. The way they see the world, their independence, the budding romance between Peaches and Perry, all of it feels like what I'd expect from characters that are older than 10 years old. But also, so much of Perry's journey feels like... It feels like that coming into teenage years kind of journey. Now, I do recognize that I myself am someone who clung to my childhood as long as humanly possible, and so maybe other kids were going through that whole understanding adults as grown children thing earlier than I did. But that part of their journey really did feel like something I'd expect from, like, 12-year-olds. And Casey. Casey works beautifully as a more grounded character in the beginning of this book. He's a little more of a cipher than any of the other characters, because he's the only major adult POV character. He's also introduced as a slightly insider-outsider perspective on New Orleans because he's been away. He has spent the last, at least I think a decade, living elsewhere. And so he is and is not part of the city the way that the others are, which gives us another entry into this world. And even before we know what's going on, he gives us a foundation of the concept of New Orleans versus NOLA to work on. And that all works beautifully. Also, he's just an interesting character, a great mix of sure of his place in the world and still a little bit lost, that I think most of us can feel a connection to. And I love the slow way we realize how he connects to the rest of the story. And also it's just fun that without intending to, I picked up another book immediately after the last one with a trans man as a major character, which is cool, but it's also another one of those books where I love the fact that his transness isn't really the main thrust of his narrative. It's there, but it's nowhere near all that's going on with him. But here's the thing about the characters. I feel like the balance between all the characters is... I wrote a little bit, but I'm going to say more than a little bit off. Casey disappears for way too long in the third act when you consider how much of a major character he had been up until that point, and how much setup he gets for the climax. And on that note, I'll be honest, the conclusion of this book does not work for me at all. Like, it felt really loose. Like, there was something soft about what was happening. And I'll admit, I was just a bit confused as to what was literally happening. I think I know what literally happened in the climax of the book, but I'm not sure. And I really don't think that's a great way to feel about a climax of a book. And then the falling action just did not give us enough time with anyone but Casey to know where the chips had landed. Like, we get a good bit with Casey, we get about 3 pages with Perry, and then it's over. And we're left wondering, is Fess alive? Ish? Will Daddy Deke keep being around? Has Casey made contact with the other Graves? Is Mama Lisa still around? And, like, Brindy is way too important of a character to just get absolutely nothing in the falling action. Like, we are left just assuming she's still alive. We don't see her. She's mentioned in passing, and that's it. What happens with Peaches? Her father? And, like, some of this feels like setup for a sequel, especially when we get a completely new character introduced in the last page of the falling action. But some of this just felt like we were left hanging. And this is going to get its own little section here because it does feel like a great exemplar for what's happening across the rest of the book. The Hanging Judge. So there will be some spoilers in this, but only about the Hanging Judge, which is a very small part of this book. The Hanging Judge comes from one New Orleans to the other, and he has a huge emotional impact on Perry. And the way he's introduced and the way he's talked about feels like he's there to be an epitomization of the trauma that systemic racism has on children and people growing up, with beautiful passages like on page 175. It would do no good to beat the Hanging Judge even if Peaches could get her hands on it. The judge simply was. It was a fact of life, and the sooner Perry learned to live with that, the sooner the pain would become dull and bearable. His mere existence is a weight on Perry, limiting him, making Perry shy away from his own power for fear of drawing attention to himself. He feels like the racism of the real world being accidentally transmitted from our world to theirs. It's so clear that he is going to be the connection between Perry and Casey's stories, and that's how they're going to overlap. And then he just fucking disappears from the narrative without any resolution. Like, Perry literally just thinks he doesn't need to be scared of the Hanging Judge anymore, and that's it. How did we not have the hanging judge involved in the climax? How did we not have a scene where the hanging judge almost kills Casey and Perry has to save him? How did we not get a scene that clarified what the hell the judge meant to Casey? It's fucking brilliant setup, and it doesn't stick the landing. And there's also a problem with intuition in this book. Like, there's a running theme of trying to get to the point where you just trust your intuition, and that's a hard theme to get right. If you give the reader too much information that the characters are about what the characters are supposed to intuit, the reader spends the entire book shouting, "How do you not realize what's going on?" But if you give the reader no signs of what's really going on, it feels like you didn't know how to get the information to your characters and so just had them magically know. And that felt like what was going on in a lot of places in this book. Like Casey knowing to go in the weird door between the bathrooms at Rouse's, that I buy. Perry being able to know what the magic items are just by touch from his sack, I buy that. Perry just knowing he needs to dive into the weird water on his first spirit quest, I totally buy that. Perry just magically knowing who the big bad is, I don't buy it. Perry knowing where Peaches went as soon as she's gone, I don't buy it. Casey's entire part of the climax, I 100% don't buy it. But also Casey in that last bit switches from a character to a deus ex machina that it felt like the author just didn't know what to do with him. And that's its own huge problem with the climax. Like, a major character just shows up, waves around some magic he barely knew how to do when last we saw him, fights off a distraction, and disappears. But I also want to talk about the knowledge you can expect a reader to come to a book with versus what you have to spoon feed them. This book is very deeply entrenched in New Orleans history, New Orleans culture, and just New Orleans in general, and very little of it is defined or explained. I live in New Orleans. I'm a fucking tour guide in New Orleans, and some of this I had to pause to look up. And there's an almost constant reference to New Orleans history, and specifically New Orleans musical history, to New Orleans places, to New Orleans traditions, and almost all of it is just references. And to a certain extent, I think that's fine. Like, a lot of it is sort of added color that if you know who these random jazz musicians are, cool. If you don't, no big deal. If you know who Buddy Bolden was and what his story is, it adds a layer to the book. But I think you can read on by without knowing and not feel the need to go look it up. A lot of the references are subtle enough that I can imagine someone not even realizing that these are real places or people or whatnot. There are a few things that I suspect were references, but I didn't get them, and it didn't bother me enough to stop reading and go investigate. But, and this is a real big but, I do think that there are a lot of things in this book that if you don't know anything about New Orleans, you might really have no idea what the hell is happening. If you don't know who Dr. John is, you might get really annoyed reading this book. If you don't know the major music genres that came out of New Orleans and how they interact, you might get confused. If you don't know how African American culture and Native American culture intermingled here, you might be lost. And I know that if you did not recognize the Pippi Longstocking reference, it's distractingly obvious that you are missing something. And like, I know a good bit about the history of New Orleans, and I didn't know who the main haint was, and I had to stop to look him up, because there is so little exposition in the book about who he is, how he connects to the city, and why he is the one that the author chose to use as this big haint. And I stopped and looked him up, and I still feel like I'm missing something. Though that's largely because Wikipedia just didn't have that much information on him, and I just am not feeling inclined to dig out serious sources just to know why the author chose this random historical figure to include in this book. And it's a book that if you are not comfortable feeling like you are missing something, you better know a hell of a lot about New Orleans, or have your search engines ready. And I do feel like that's going to be annoying to a lot of readers. But for me, while this was definitely an odd book, it was one I absolutely loved up until about the last 20 pages. And those last 20 pages were still good enough that it did not ruin the entire book for me. it just wasn't as strong as the rest. I definitely recommend this one to any New Orleanian readers, or anyone who just wants to feel entrenched in New Orleans, or at least the idea of New Orleans. And I'm really excited to see what else this author comes out with, because in the end, this felt like the great beginning of an author. Like, not necessarily like the beginning of a series, but like an author who is still figuring out how to put brilliant pieces together into a whole. It's been a long while since I've read a book that I loved this much, while also being utterly ambivalent about it. Like, I loved it, and I'm furious with it. And it's brilliant, and it's a bit of a mess. Which, honestly, is the most New Orleans thing you could possibly write. So, yeah. This is a very New Orleans book. And I'm going to eat some king cake. That's good.